Okay, hello everybody. I'm glad to be here. Thanks for the organizers. I'm very glad to be at NYU. Uh, Long time haven't been there as a result of what's going on. So I would like to speak about the future of occupation from my own perspective. And I would like to first say that when speaking of the future of occupation, we are mainly speaking of the future of the state of Israel. Uh, because we are actually talking about a one-state reality since 1967. Occupation is not an outside extension of the Israeli state, but rather an integral part of its structure and policies. And therefore, we have to pose analytical questions about the best conceptual, theoretical, and ethical ways to analyze this complex reality. Second point I would like to make is clarify that when speaking of the occupation, we are talking about a territory that is controlled by a state that does not wish to include the population that lives on this territory into its own population. This selection policy does not mean that they are not part of it. For the same state that excludes the Palestinian population determines everything or every detail of their lives. This exclusive inclusion, which means that the Palestinians are included through their exclusion into the Israeli state, reveal the racial character of the controlling state that has been seeking to square the circle for over 5 decades while portraying itself as the victim of this reality, despite the fact that this state determines every detail on this territory. Third, we have to take into consideration that when speaking of the occupation, we are speaking of a power mechanism of politicide, aiming, and here I'm citing Professor Baruch Kemmerling from the Hebrew, aiming to sabotage the basic rights of Palestinians for self-determination for the second time, actually, after they have lost it in 1940. Occupation makes this right present as much as it makes it present internationally and locally. For the Palestinian right for self-determination is internationally recognized, and it's recognized for all Palestinians, no matter where they live, including, of course, Palestinians living under occupation in 1967, Palestinians living in exile, and Palestinians living inside the Israeli state within the Green Line. This means that the occupation could be a sophisticated conceptualization, actually, to enable bypassing the consequences of the 1948 war or making them present. Therefore, it invites the inevitable need to regulate the relationship between Israelis and Palestinians, between the river and the sea. This understanding is deduced from the reality that has resulted from the unwillingness that have become inability of Israel as a sovereign state to determine its own geostrategic borders and be satisfied with what has become internationally recognized after 1940. Occupying the West Bank and Gaza Strip in 1967 and the strategic and demographic Israeli policies since then have created a reality that is not easily decomposable. Although I'm not convinced that what has been done so far is not irreversible, I'm fully convinced that the political power to take such a step does not exist in Israel as a result of the changes that have been taking place in Israeli society in the last decades, especially the rising nationalist and religious sentiments among the majority of Israeli Jews. This change has been translated in the last election, for instance, into almost 75% of the elected MKs who belong to the nationalist religious camp and view the West Bank as part of the fatherland that cannot be compromised. This large majority does not only does not recognize the right of the Palestinians over the land, but also views them as an enemy an internal enemy that poses an immediate threat to the exclusive right of Jews over the land of Israel, and therefore have to be squeezed into small ghettoized areas fully controlled by Israel. Therefore, the occupation has become an internal Israeli problem, not a problem with the Palestinians only. That is how we should analyze it. Israel has had the possibility to solve this problem, to sort out this problem, sorry, with the Palestinians. And as a result of the aspirations and beliefs of a growing part of its leadership and population has not found the courage to do so. And when one leader tried to be decisive on the issue, he was assassinated, marking the fate of any future leader that may try to follow this lead. Having said that, let me add another analytical note and clarify that in order to better analyze and understand the relationship between Israel and the occupation, we have to differentiate between occupation as a tangible economic, militaristic, legal, and social reality, and occupation as a conceptual construction that, while informing us about this reality, it shapes the relationship between these two interrelated components in ways that deserve attention. Occupation is fast and oppressive reality and the state of exception in which the nature of the violent sovereign power transformed the existence of people living under occupation into bare life, as defined by Giorgio Agamben. Palestinians are not only deprived of their right for self-determination, but also suffer the brutal and fierce hand of the Israeli military and the racial aggressive intrusions of the settlers into the all intimate spheres of their lives on a daily basis. The brutal reality is an integral part of Israel, and any treatment of the occupation as an external entity is but part and parcel of the hegemonic conceptual and diplomatic strategy of the Israeli state to maintain its control of the occupied territories without having to pay the price on the international level and without admitting that its Jewish and democratic identity is stamped with racial differentiation and national exclusion. Therefore, when we seek a genuine understanding of the Israeli reality, we have to replace our vertical epistemological and ontological concepts, which differentiate between Israel as the sphere of normality and the West Bank and Gaza as the sphere of abnormality, with horizontal conceptualizations that allow us to better see how the normalization of Jewish life between the river and the sea, which means establishing infrastructures of continuity and control, actually means the denormalization and dehumanization of Palestinian lives, which are translated into enclaving them in territorial islands surrounded by Jewish settlements. This policy is true for Palestinian towns, not in the West Bank, as much as for Palestinian towns inside the Green Line. That's why the differentiation on the vertical level is not valid. Actually, the horizontal look or perspective on what's going on show us that the differences between what's going on in the occupied territories 1967 are not different substantially from what's going on in the Galilee and the Negev. This means that the occupation is a state of mind as well as a tangible policy practiced daily on the ground in the entire territory between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean Sea. As hinted earlier, we ought to differentiate between the fierce reality I have just analyzed and its conceptualizations by Israelis. The occupation was originally conceptualized as a temporal and instrumental depiction of Israel's control of the territories occupied in the 1967 war. It was initially conceptualized by Israeli liberals who accepted the principle of partition and the Israeli interest in facilitating a solution of the conflict with the Palestinians based on territorial and demographic separation in order to allow for the protection of the Jewish and democratic identity of Israel, and only as a result, the realization of a minimal form of Palestinian self-determination. But it's still a liberal view of occupation. This liberal and partially humanist perception has been very soon instrumentalized by mainstream nationalists such as Dayan, Moshe Dayan, Yigal Allon, Shimon Peres, Yitzhak Rabin, who gradually became worried of the demographic weight of the Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza, and their consequences on the balance between Palestinians and Jews in the same territory. This mainstream position became strategic, imposing occupation as temporary and a bargaining chip vis-a-vis Jordan and the rest of the Arab countries. This position was not clean of the immediate attempts to improve the Israeli position in any future negotiations by reinitiating the same pre-1948 incremental settlement strategy. The Alon Plan has become the unofficial Israeli position during the Rabin Peres government in the 1970s. This was translated into control of the strategic areas of the West Bank, especially the hills that overlook the Israeli cities on the shore and the Jordan Valley. Given that Israel's regime has been established based on majoritarian principles with a proportional electoral system, it has been always sensitive to transformations in the Israeli democracy. This sensitivity has been translated into the shift of power from the labor movement to the Likud movement and its allies in 1977. This shift marked the gradual expansion of the nationalist and religious forces in Israeli society and the shrinking power of the liberal camp. The changing Israeli demography, especially as a result of the immigration from the former Soviet Union and the natural growth of the ultra-Orthodox community, majoritarianism has become a basic power mechanism for the nationalist religious forces that view the West Bank as a core part of the promised land of Israel. The rise of this nationalist religious force enabled them to occupy the center of the political system, increase their power in state administration, and to dominate the institutions of the Likud party that became the dominant party in the Israeli political system. This means that majoritarianism has become a very effective tool in facilitating nationalist policies, particularly the expansion of the Jewish settlements in the areas occupied in 1967. The nationalist and religious forces challenged the liberal conceptualization of occupation and gradually managed to create a U-turn in the Israeli public consciousness towards their settlement policies. At the initial stages and until the 1980s, this process meant that the perception of occupation began changing and the nationalist religious ideology began to be a challenging strategy. As indicated before, in the last attempt to prioritize strategy over ideology, the clash between these perceptions ended up with the assassination of the Prime Minister Rabin for his willingness to compromise part of what the nationalist religious social forces considered to be a core of the fatherland. This clash reached new peaks during the attempt made by Sharon, the former prime minister, to rebalance strategy and ideology in 2005 by pulling out from the Gaza Strip. This step ended up with a mini civil war that remains a warning reminder for any prime minister who seeks any compromising formula entailing evacuating Israeli settlements. The withdrawal from Gaza led to the victimization of the settlers, providing them with backwinds in the settlement efforts made in the West Bank. It enabled them to occupy increasing power positions in the main junctures of power in the state and the political system, blocking thereby any effort to change the status quo. Again, the majoritarian decision-making mechanisms enabled them to control the legislative and executive branch and to deter the judicial system from taking steps that don't meet their expectations. The Palestinians on their side, while having the full and internationally recognized right to resist against occupation, committed several strategic mistakes that compromised their moral standing and their ability to exert pressure on Israeli society and the international community. Let me address this point shortly. First, the PLO's engagement in the Oslo process from a very weak position has led to agreeing to the impossible conditions imposed by the Israeli government, having created a structural reality in which the Palestinians, especially the PA, are totally dependent on Israel's goodwill. Second, internal Palestinian disagreements have led to the use of the immoral mean of resisting occupation, namely suicide bombing. This use has led to the erosion of the international support for the Palestinians and to the bonding of the various political camps in Israeli society against compromising any compromise with them. Third, the withdrawal from Gaza, the rise of Hamas to power there, and its war strategy of deterrence strengthened the position of the hardliners in the security establishment in Israel. Those hardliners utilized the experience with Gaza as a strong tool to warn against the dangers entailed in any withdrawal from the West Bank. Fourth, the eruption of broad civil protests in many Arab countries and the destabilization of several historically stable regimes, such as in Egypt, Syria, Libya, and the looming threat awaiting other regimes, especially in the Gulf, have led to the downsizing of the Palestinian issue in the regional balances of power. Fifth, the rise of the Iranian power in the region created new opportunities that ended up serving Israeli strategic interests in downsizing the Palestinians and actually normalizing its relationship with part of the Gulf states. These developments have transformed the nature of the relationship between the strategic calculations marked by the security establishment and the ideological social forces, especially those viewing the West Bank as an integral part of the promised land that cannot be compromised. The fusion of ideological beliefs and strategic considerations have become the worldview of the majority of Israeli society. This has been achieved by the fact that the ideological elites, nationalist and religious, practice their power, utilizing psychological means in order to convince a growing number of Israelis that any change in the status quo entails not only compromising central parts of the father's land, but also security risks that are not worth taking, for nobody can guarantee that the scenario of the Gaza Strip would not repeat itself in the West Bank. This means that the one-state reality has become part and parcel of the Israeli psycho-political belief system. The coming together of ideological and security considerations, combined with the low cost of keeping Palestinians in their enclaves, make it easier for a majority in the Jewish society to pay the price of maintaining the status quo compared with the dangers, especially civil war, entailed in its transformation. Therefore, it does not matter if the current demographic reality is reversible or not. What matters is the lack of political will and ability inside Israeli Jewish society to change the low-cost reality in the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. The delegitimizing of the Arab vote inside the majoritarian system is part and parcel of the efforts made by nationalist and religious political forces to preserve the status quo. This means that the efforts that have been made by Arab parties inside the Israeli political system in the last few years and the effort to integrate into the system in order to influence the process of decision-making is being blocked by nationalist and religious political forces that are worried that a coalition between center-left bloc and Arab parties could lead to changing the course of history regarding what's going on in the occupied territories in 1967. This means that speaking of occupation by liberal Israeli and international voices actually serves the status quo. If occupation is not only about what's going on in the West Bank, if occupation is actually comes to differentiate between the sphere of normality and the sphere of abnormality as if they are separate spheres. Speaking about occupation and marking the 1967 areas only actually becomes a diplomatic tool in order to maintain the status quo. That's why we should rather speak of the settler colonial regime between the river and the sea, and made it clear that Israel is neither only Jewish nor marked by a democratic regime. This means that we have to make clear that Israel, as a Jewish and democratic state within the Green Line, has long ceased to exist. We have to admit that there is a demographic balance between Jews and Palestinians between the river and the sea. Large part of those who live in this area do not participate in determining its fate. They are deprived of the individual rights to vote or the collective rights for self-determination, or both. This reality does not mean that speaking about occupation does not mean that this reality does not exist. This is actually the reality on the ground, and that's what we should analyze and look at. That's why occupation, as I said before, is not only about what's happening in the 1967 areas. The social forces, the main social forces that determine actually the fate of these areas live within the Green Line. And therefore, we have to take them into consideration when we actually analyze what's going on beyond the Green Line. The separation is a technical issue that does not have any base in reality. Therefore, only when Jews and Palestinians come together in order to guarantee a moral political life for both peoples, learning the art of power sharing, that we can stop speaking of Israel as a settler colonial entity. This means that as long as occupation is considered and called occupation, as if it is not part of Israel, we serve the hegemonic Israeli nationalist religious worldview. Those who still want to portray the occupation as temporary actually assist in maintaining the status quo or preserving this occupation. This also enables the hegemonic nationalists in Israel to maintain the democratic mask with majoritarian decisions, ignoring the questions: how come the occupier has the right to make decisions regarding the future of the occupied demography or population without the latter being asked to participate? The Israeli majoritarian system has become into a sophisticated instrument that portrays Israel as a democratic state, whereas it promotes, through its majoritarian decision-making, it promotes actually a non-democratic reality. Based on the former analysis, I'm able to conclude that the occupation is a state of exception that is included in order to exclude and excludes in order to include. It is instrumental in marking the wished for differentiation between the sphere of the abnormal that justifies the normal. It is not really outside the system, but part of it that is not identical with its identity. It is constructed in order to be excluded without being fully external. It remains within the system, but not as part, but is not portrayed as part of it. This differentiation enables defining it as a better order that is worth submitting to. It destructs any other option that could form an alternative to it. It simultaneously justifies neglecting it in the eyes of the Jewish citizens, since it deserves the destructive policy towards it. It proves the justified neglect policy towards it by its mere objection to the logic of power that submits it to a vicious circle of violence and submission. Given this reality and the way it is conceived by Israelis, who will try to maintain the status quo for the coming time, and I have to clarify here that the status quo is a dynamic rather than static situation, reflecting a creeping apartheid system, mainly in the territories occupied in 1967, but actually drifting into inside the Green Line. And one of the manifestations that we have to take into consideration as a reflection of this drift actually is the nation state law that passed in the Knesset in 2018 that defines Israel as exclusively as the nation state of the Jewish people, thereby excluding actually its non-Jewish citizens, mainly the Palestinians, and ignoring actually the fact that millions of Palestinians live under the Israeli control system inside what Israel, or the law, this basic law, considered as the land of Israel. Meaning that there are Palestinians inside the land of Israel that are not considered existent based on the law and have no national rights on the one hand, but also don't enjoy individual rights on the other hand, and they can't take part in the Israeli electoral system in order to have any power in influencing what happens with them in the future. The Palestinians have learned, in my view, the Palestinians have learned the lessons of the past and will not use violence to abrupt the status quo, at least in the West Bank. Demography will at the end have the upper hand. And in my view, it will lead to the need for the democratization of the entire space between the river and the sea. This democratization process will become inevitable because Israel cannot continue hiding the control system it has established between the river and the sea under democratic veil. The unveiling of the exclusivist policies taking place vis-a-vis Palestinians while submitting them actually to exclusive Jewish sovereignty cannot continue forever. And therefore, the democratization process will have to take place in order to solve this conflict. For that to happen, we may have to endure another bloody clash between the two sides, but I hope that the liberal forces who will have to recognize the dangers entailed in the current status quo, which is creeping apartheid on both sides of the green line, will have to stop and will have to work together in order to stop it. And therefore, the working together of Palestinians and Israelis in order to overcome this dangerous reality is becoming a pressing need that cannot wait longer. Thank you very much for listening, and I hope that I did not leave you with too pessimistic view of what's going on in this Holy Land. Thank you very much.